and I hear from the bleachers, Danny Cohen, if you know what's good for you, you'll get back on that mound.
None of us become who we're meant to be alone. Every story has people who helped write it. So let's talk about them. Welcome to the Mentor Sessions.
All right, welcome everybody back to the Mentor Sessions podcast. I'm your host, Big Mike. Today I am with Dan Cohen, who wrote a very fascinating book and has a very fascinating story to tell about his relationship with his father. Anyone who's been touched by dementia or Alzheimer knows just how hard it is to watch someone suffer in that space. And it's just so sad. My wife's grandmother had Alzheimer, and watching her slowly deteriorate mentally, the toll it took on the family. So, Dan, welcome to the show, and why don't you go ahead and tell us your story?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And the Mentor Sessions is very appropriate because my father was my mentor in life. And I think it's important to understand who he was to me, and then you can understand my story. So my father was a very big presence in my life growing up until he started to fade away from dementia. He was a big personality. He exuded love. He was demonstratively loving. He was a street guy, but very smart in that respect. So he built a big business without ever having to go to college. He was my confidant, my problem solver, probably my best friend. So it was a very big presence in my life. And interestingly enough, so I wrote a book called Awakenings in Real Life, and we'll get that into a minute. But the last chapter in my book, I say, who is your one? And maybe it's another name for mentor or hero, but to me, it's slightly different. And I think that everybody in life should have that one person who A, loves you unconditionally, but B, has no ego when it comes to you, wants you to succeed and have more success than you ever have. It could be a mentor, it could be a hero, but my father was that person for me, and I don't think there's a statute of limitations on it. So I don't think when you become an adult, it means you still don't have that person in your life. So he played that role. Did someone play that role in your life, Mike?
Oh yeah, certainly. And my dad, in a lot of respects, played that role for me as well. I have some fond memories, and I actually spoke about him on a short recently, since we just celebrated Father's Day,
Right.
where recently my dad and I went out to lunch to celebrate Father's Day, and we were talking about that out here in Idaho, what's called Big Sky Country, where you could just look up to the heavens and see stars for days and days and days. And when I was growing up, we had a little 5-acre plot of land that my dad and I, just standing out there with him and watching those stars and just looking at the vastness of space. Years later, once I had my kids and I'd moved out, we took a family vacation where all of my siblings and my parents and we got together outside Yellowstone at a park called Red Lodge, Montana. And I think it was the first night, once night hit, Dad and I went running outside to see the sky. And that's one of few favorite stories I have about my father. How about you? What's a moment from your childhood that can really help drive home the closeness and the relationship you had with your dad?
Yeah, he was always there for me, always a problem solver. I'll tell you a very quick story. So I played Little League Baseball in those days, and I don't know what it is today. They allow the fathers to coach the kids. I think it's the worst thing that ever happens because they typically favor the kids. But when I was younger, the fathers had to coach a different team. So I was a pitcher on the Little League. I don't know why this story comes to me. And I threw a pitch, guy hits a home run. Throw the next pitch, boom, hits a home run. I decide I've had enough. I throw down my glove. I start walking off the man, and I hear from the bleachers, Danny Cohen, if you know what's good for you, you'll get back on that mound. Very funny. But this was the same guy that saved my first win and my no-hitter. So he was a very special guy, and it's interesting. I meet people years later that have it from the neighborhood, right? And they say, I had your father as a little league coach. I loved him so much. So that's just a funny story about the type of guy he was. But he was very involved, and I call him the world's greatest problem solver because he seemed to be able to solve every problem we had. And
I've got to interrupt because your story just reminded me about my dad. I played football in high school, and football is a big part of our relationship. We love to just sit and watch football together. My fondest memories watching football were when it was me, my dad, and my grandfather. There are some Monday night football games that they're just core memories that kind of help bring me to a happy time in my life and stuff. But my dad, kind of like yours, had a very distinctive voice,
yeah,
and it didn't matter where I was out on the field, how packed the field was and the bleachers. I could always pick out his voice cheering us on and screaming for us. And man, if that's not a way to keep you motivated and keep you going, is hearing that voice and knowing
it's
that he's
true.
there. We went to a road game one time, and our game was during the middle of the work day, and I looked over at the bleachers, and Dad was right there. He took off work so that he could come and support and watch, and yeah, it was great, man.
It's interesting you bring up football because living in the New York area, my father was a diehard New York Jets fan. So, or should I say, a long suffering Jets fan because, all right, we won the Super Bowl. I was a young kid, but it's been how many years they haven't won. But they used to practice in Long Island. Now they're in Jersey and we Long Island. He used to go to the practices. That's how inwards. I'll tell you another quick story about my father. My son and I went, and my son's a big Jets fan, and I'm a big Jets fan, and we went, and they had a birthday club, right? And supposedly you get a birthday card or something, or you get a package from your favorite player. And my father loved Wayne Corbett. And this part of it has to do, you'll see with the Awakening too, was very undersized receiver who made it against all odds. And he was smaller, but he ended up having a great, great career. So my son signs up that he's going to get a package on his birthday. So, and his birthday's in March. So he's waiting and waiting and waiting. March comes, nothing. We don't get anything from the Jets, or we just get a generic birthday card. So my son is so disappointed. So I call up my father to tell the story. A week later, we get an autographed jersey from Wayne Corbett. We get an autographed picture from Wayne Corbett. He gets a personalized birthday card from Wayne Corbett. He called the Jets, my father, and lo and behold, he made his grandson very happy. So that's the type of guy he was.
I think we can go on with stories about these all day, back and forth. And let me just end with this one, and then let's start getting into the Awakenings
Okay,
and that story.
sure.
My dad is a diehard Denver Broncos fan, and I mean my whole life, and that's the way I rebelled as a young man. As I became a Raiders fan to rebel against Dad. A few years ago, my nephews and my son, they all pitched in, and they arranged it with my brother who lives out in the Denver area, and my brother-in-law, and they surprised my dad and I with Denver Bronco tickets, and we got an Airbnb out there, and we spent a weekend together and went to a game together. Well, my brother is also he's an active duty law enforcement, and he worked at the school where Ed McCaffrey was the football
Ah,
coach. So he arranged for, we were up in the bleachers. He saw Ed up there with the football team, and he's like, "Hey, let's go talk to Ed." And Ed came over and spent about 5 or 10 minutes with my dad, and took pictures, shook his hand. They talked about you know those days, and that was before Christian McCaffrey was
right,
coming up. He was
right,
still in
right.
college. But man, what a great opportunity to, when we get to see our dad's face light up like that, like we do as a boy, that stole the show right there. That was just so powerful.
Yeah, one of the last memories. My father had a stroke that led to his dementia, but not shortly before his stroke, we went to a Jets game together. My son, lifelong Jets fan too, right? Married a woman, father from Detroit, diehard Lions fan. Now the Lions have been doing better than the Jets, right? So I have a relatively a 1-year-old grandson, and I said to my son, your son better be a diehard Jets fan. He goes, Dad, I can't promise you that. He's either going to be a Lions or a Jets fan. I said, well, I may have to disown you if he becomes a Lions fan. And we made a 75th birthday party for him, which was interesting. And he got to hear from my mother down to the youngest grandkids. They all talked and shared how much they love my father. But 5 months after that, he had a stroke. Okay. And my brother's a doctor. He was walking into my brother's office at the time for a doctor's visit, and they knew immediately he was having a stroke. One side of his face was drooping. Another sign of a stroke is if they ask you to smile and you can't smile. He was bleeding in his brain. So within 10 minutes, they actually got him to a hospital, literally saved his life, and they stopped the bleed. And he ended up living another 11 years. And unfortunately, the stroke led to dementia. So, what I think is important, you mentioned your grandmother had Alzheimer's, and a lot of people, Alzheimer's and dementia are maybe two different things. Dementia is the symptoms for Alzheimer's and other conditions. So it's a decline in mental functioning over a period of time, and it runs in stages. It runs in 7 stages. And in the beginning, you can confuse it for age-related things. They might not remember a name or something, but over time, it really runs the gamut. One of the first few things you lose is short-term memory, but it runs all the way to the gamut where, because your brain affects a lot of your motor functions, towards the end, my father really couldn't walk, and he was incontinent and some other things. So dementia can be caused a number of different ways. A blow to the head, like a stroke. Certain illnesses can cause dementia. Alzheimer's, which most people know, is plaque in the brain. And then there's vascular dementia, what people used to call senility, which is a hardening of the arteries. So my father in 2005 had a stroke. It led to dementia, and it happened in stages. And you're watching someone that's fading away. It's almost like mourning someone who's living. And when they're a very big presence in your life, it's very difficult. You can go to a neurologist and say, what stage is my loved one in? Are they in 4? Are they 6? Are they in 7? And I never choose to do that. My family never chose to do that. We as a family knew where my father was at. We didn't need anybody to tell us it's stage 5 or stage 7. I just thought it would give me more angst to know exactly where he was. It's up to the individual. If I ask people, I say, you know where your loved one is. And the interesting is, you know better than the neurologist because you're living with the person or seeing them more
So let
often.
me ask you real quick: were there any
Sure.
signs that he was starting to slip before the stroke?
That's a really great question. And it's so interesting that when I was at the football game with him, which was a few months before, he was himself, he really, but for some reason, I didn't think he was as sharp as he normally was. But my brother, the doctor, so when my father had the stroke and started to show some, he like researched everything. I think he was tortured because he knew too much. But, we're pretty much convinced that the stroke led to the dementia. I don't think there's anybody else in the family that had Alzheimer's or dementia. I don't know if it would have happened anyway. When you're aging, you're not as sharp. So we pretty much think it was from the dementia. But I did notice at that game that he didn't seem quite as sharp as he was. But we really think it was the stroke that led to the dementia.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because when we're in the moment, it's hard to see if he's aging. But then my mom was in a car accident, got a traumatic brain injury. My mom was so quick, so witted. She was an attorney and so smart. But when you started seeing that slip, and it got to the point where she would say something and we'd have to be like, Mom, where are you right now? And she's like, well, we're at Nana's house. And she'd look around and she's like, wait, this isn't Nana's house. And we're like, no, Mom, you're at home. And just watching that kind of going back and forth into the mindset. So that's why I asked, if there were signs
Yeah.
before.
But it's interesting. So one of the things that I tell people that I share, and maybe could have been applicable to your situation, acceptance. And this can apply to someone with a traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's, dementia, or other mental conditions, in that you got to accept your person for where they're at. So, especially since dementia runs in stages, so they'll maybe not know where they are. They might ask you the same question 20 times, right? They might repeat the same thing over and over. And our natural tendency, as human beings, is to challenge someone. Oh, Dad, I told you that already. Or don't you remember? You asked me the same thing, or you told me the same story. But it's not a rational decision. It's part of their brain is not functioning well. And other thing you hear people say is, wow, my loved one was so much better 6 months ago. Well, yeah, it's a downward, irreversible condition, and they're going to be worse 6 months later. If you can accept them who they are, that's number one. And two, you got to give yourself some acceptance and grace, because you're not always going to be perfect. But if you can accept them where they're at, right, it's going to be so much less frustrating for you in dealing with your loved one, right? Because you'll understand that they're not repeating something or asking you something over and over to frustrate you. This is just how their mind is working. And if you give yourself a little grace too, you're not going to be perfect. There are times you're going to get a little frustrated, but that's something I try to recommend to people. And whether you, even physical illness is a thing, it's really to accept your loved one where they're at. But I'll tell you something interesting, Mike. My mother, who lived with my father every day, she was like the last one to catch on to his mental condition. She always felt he was more capable than he was. Where the children who didn't live with him every day, we recognized him more, and my brother, the doctor, more. And when I started to think about it, or speaking to people, they think she was probably in denial. She had this big personality, man who's capable of so many things, that she was the last to really get all the things he was going through. So I found that very interesting as well.
Yeah, why do you think that is, that she was the last to catch on? Do you think it was a denial thing?
I think it was a denial thing. I write a chapter in the book, The World's Greatest Problem Solver. He could seemingly make the impossible possible. And I just think she still viewed him like that way for a long time. I think maybe it was denial. Yeah, but it was so interesting to me that she, who saw it more than anybody else, it set in for her the latest. Maybe denial. Oh, maybe it
Yeah,
was right that she didn't want to view him like that.
yeah.
So
I don't think we covered this. What kind of work did your dad do as you were growing up?
my father didn't go to college. Uh, he was a businessman. He was a salesman. I like to say one of the world's greatest salesmen. He was a great closer. He had the great gift for gab. He proudly kept his best salesman trophy from standard uniform. You said you got into uniforms, right?
Yeah.
At one point, he and then he went into business with a brother of his. They sold maintenance chemicals and lighting over the phone. So I like to say that my father, in a sense, revolutionized telemarketing, because he took products that were typically sold door to door and figured out a way to sell them over the phone. And he built a very nice company in the late 70s, early 80s. Very innovative. He knew how to pitch, he knew how to close. So, and I think that had to do with his street smarts. So he built a very successful company. Now it's a whole different world. But in those days, you didn't sell those chemicals or lights. It was always door to door. And
You grew up like in the New York City area, or?
yeah, so we grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I don't know if you can tell from my accent. We grew up in the Coney Island, Brighton Beach area of Brooklyn. He grew up in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, which is very hip now. But when he grew up, it wasn't so hip. He was the youngest of three older brothers, and it was a different generation. These guys are much tougher than my generation. They really can handle themselves if they needed to. And my father had gotten into some street fights, some famous stories I share in the book. Too, he was an undefeated boxer in the army. He was 26-0. Yeah, so we have some classic stories of my father in the book. He was a protector of his friends. He if someone messed with him, he was the guy that stepped in. So
So you mentioned your mom was the last one to catch on,
yeah.
and I think basically accept it. What was that impact like when you guys as the children saw that mom was starting to accept what was going on? How did that the way
When she started to really accept who it was, then, then the sadness on her end set in, so we had to make sure that we because she was 24/7 with him. At a certain point, as he really got bad, we brought in help, and we actually brought in help in the house. The other thing I share with people is inclusion. While your person is still around on this life, include them in activities. And you'll see when I tell you about the awakening story why that was so important. But I would come, and I lived about 2 hours away, at least once a week, sometimes more. And I always took them to a movie and lunch. Now, my mother loved movies and my father loved movies, but at a certain point, what really goes is short-term memory. So I knew 5 minutes after leaving the theater, he wouldn't remember. But it didn't matter because sometimes in the movie, uh, especially if it was a sad movie, you'd see the tears in his eyes. So he was present there. I wrote an article before the awakening. I wrote, I wish I could flip a switch and wake up my father. I know he's still in there. And I just felt that his presence was there, And also, you talk less and less, you're less verbal. I had a feeling he was there. And then we had this remarkable 2-day awakening where he showed me he was there. But I'll tell you a situation where my mother was going to a 90th party for her aunt. And she said to me and my brother and sister, I'm the middle child, you got to come and stay overnight with dad. So we all did. And then the next time we got together, we said, what did you do with dad? And I said, oh, I took him to a movie. And then my brother says, oh, we took him to a movie too. And my sister, we look at it, she goes, yeah, we took him to a movie too. What movie did you take him to? So I said, oh, I took him to Argo. That was the Ben Affleck hit at the time. And my brother turns to us and goes, oh, we took him to Argo too. And we look at my sister, goes, yep, we took him to Argo too. And we were all hysterical, okay? And I'm sure my father was happy to be with his children tonight. And he didn't remember from day to day. And we thought it was the funniest thing. Can I tell you something, Mike? When I drove home that night, I actually cried. I was so sad. We really were not accepting my father. If we were accepting him for where he was at, we would have taken him to 3 different movies, even if he didn't remember, because he deserved to go to 3 different movies. That's what I talk about, acceptance and inclusion. But, we wanted to keep my mother active in things too, because it's not easy being home with someone like that. I was very proud of her because my father growing up was not that my mother wasn't strong, but he was the problem solver. He was the guy who took care of things, She was the college educated. She was the teacher. So they complemented each other. She knew the importance of education for her children, and he was a street smart guy, but she didn't grow up in a demonstratively loving home. He didn't either. But as I share in the book, he had therapy at a very young age, at 20 years old. And because of that, he became very loving. So that rubbed off on my mother. It's important not to forget the caregiver, too. It's very easy to focus solely on the person who's going through the situation, but it had to be the most difficult for her as well. So you have to keep them busy too, and you can't forget them too. Although more of your focus is the one who's sick, you gotta include them as well.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that because that's something as my mom, her physical health was taking a toll on her. You saw the toll it was taking on my dad as the caretaker. And you spend so much time as the caretaker that you neglect your personal health
Yeah.
and stuff. But we saw Dad rejuvenate and his personal health and stuff like that. And so that's why I agree with you 100%. It's important for those that are able to step up and help to help give that caregiver that space. Like I was talking about before we started, my wife's grandmother uh, also had dementia, and she was living with my in-laws, and my mother-in-law was the primary caretaker. So those moments where you talk about how important it is to include them and be there with them. I'll tell you a funny story. We were all going to a Disney on Ice show after Thanksgiving. This is when my wife and I were first started dating, and my wife's grandmother goes, Marty, she called me Marty for some reason. Are you coming to the show with us? And I said, yeah, Grandma. I said, it's Mike. And she goes, well, you might as well. We have an extra ticket. That's a moment that
Right.
we still love, and it shows just how kind and how sweet she was.
Yeah.
Um, as she was starting to get sick. So, yeah, great point. Don't forget the caregivers.
No, no, you can't forget the caregivers. So it's interesting that when you have such a presence, what helped me is even at towards the very end, when my father was in the last stages, I'd go over and he would just kiss my hand. And he was there. That was the essence who he was, a loving man. And that was enough for me at the time. So, all right, let me tell you about the awakening, because it really solidified some of the things that I hoped for. So in 2015, he died 8 months later. Without asking, he was really in probably the last stages. So we were fortunate that he knew us for the most part. Okay, sometimes he didn't. There's a lot of times they don't recognize their loved one, and I think that would have been the hardest thing to do, even though I hear there's moments of recognition, but he still pretty much most of the time knew who he was. But he was incontinent. He couldn't eat solid foods. You forget how to chew, so it was pureed foods. Couldn't wash and bathe himself. Was basically nonverbal. You might get a word or two out of him if you addressed him specifically. When eventually we brought in help, and when he was being shaved, my brother would often shave him, or they would sponge bathe him. He'd cry out in pain. I never heard my father cry out in pain. It's very hard to hear someone you love so much, and he wasn't in pain. It was just that's how he was reacting to it. So the summer of 2015, he had 2 bouts of pneumonia. And the second bout of pneumonia, he was also hypertensive. So they gave him loads of steroids and antibiotics. And he was in the hospital. And I walk in the hospital to see my father, and he says, "Hi, Danny." And I said, "Hi, Dad." And he says, "I love you very much." And I said, "I love you very much." And he says, "What happened to me?" And I said, "Well, you got pneumonia, you're being treated by antibiotics, and then you're going to go home soon." It was a conversation like by rote. And then all of a sudden I said, "This is not the man I just saw a few days ago. This is very much like my dad. How could this be?" My brother says, he says, "I didn't put it in percentage because the bar was so low and he came back so high that he's answering every question correctly that the hair stood up on the back of his head." My brother said it was so amazing. So here's the interesting thing. So I used to think that nobody on the planet had the kind of relationship I had with my father. It was just, you know, so phenomenal. We were so close. I always thought I had a similar personality to him. And I knew he loved my siblings, but I'm the guy. He used to call me Dan the Man, and nobody has that relationship. At the 75th birthday party I mentioned, and my brother and I have very different personalities. He gets up and he says, "I want everybody to know I'm just like my father." And I said, "How could that be?" "I'm just like my father, and we're very different." And then he explained they looked more alike. They had certain traits in person. He went on to share 3 stories of my father's impact on him growing up. So really showing his love. And then I spoke, and then my sister went. And there's a lot of men in the family. There was not a lot of girls or women. So my sister came along. I used to joke I'm the deprived middle child because they had an older boy, then I came, and then my sister came. So you look at our family pictures, you see my mother, my father, my brother, my sister, and my right earlobe. So, because, and I actually have a picture like that in my book. So she said, boy, all my friends love my father because he just had that warm personality where people are drawn to him. And she said, how can you imagine being Herbie's little girl? And then she sung a song to him. And I walked away from that party saying, no, they feel exactly the same way about him as I do. He had that ability to make all his children and his wife and other people feel very special. So I write in the book that story and I call it perspectives because besides the awakening story, I put other stories, I call it mini awakenings. And everybody looks at their life through their own lens, right? And if you could see other people's perspectives, I think you can really be more empathetic, more understanding. So when my father had this awakening, right? And my father says to him, I'm happy to have a son like you. My brother describes it as one of the most seminal moments of his life. This man who had such an impact in his life, telling him he's happy to have a son like him. And it's interesting. My father, I told you, growing up was the problem solver role. My brother, when he became a doctor, he took on that role, certainly with the family, whatever the medical issues was. But he also, I was divorced, and between my father and my brother, they were really the ones that helped me get through it. And despite that, the fact that my brother took on that kind of role in the family, my father was still the guy he turned to when he needed help in any situation or looked for advice. So it was remarkable that this man that we hadn't seen really for 10 years seemed to be himself. Uh, so we really experienced, Mike, some interesting things over those 2 days. So I'd like to share that with you and your audience.
Yeah, I am so enthralled in this story because I'm having a hard time holding back my emotions and feelings, thinking about, you're talking about the role people feel in their family, and like you, I'm a middle child, and yeah, we kind of fall in that gap a little bit, but
I tongue-in-cheek blamed my mother for anything. My brother's a
yeah,
good eater. My sister's a good eater. I'm a picky eater. I said, well, I'm the deprived middle child. She fed my brother and
yeah,
sister.
right,
Great story. My father loved steak, okay? Big meat and potatoes, okay? My mother didn't really salad. So the
right,
best meat on the bone, right?
right,
So I couldn't understand when she would make steak, right? My father would eat the meat on the bone, and my brother would eat the meat on the bone, and they give me the heart of the steak because, they forgot about me. So,
yeah. Yeah,
so
you're talking about the roles, and my older sister, she is like the family anchor. There's no other way to describe her. She's the one that really steps up and helps take care of everyone when we're in need. My younger brother, he was, and I hope he's watching this so he knows I still admit it, that he was my mom's favorite. And my youngest sister was a very talented gymnast, and so I sat in kind of that like, hey, what about me? But I think a good way to put it is the comfort zone. Like I was able to make people feel comfortable. My brother and I were both good at making each other and making the family
good.
laugh.
That's good.
This is the point that I wanted to make, is that we all kind of go to those roles naturally, and then you talked about how your dad made everyone feel like they were the favorite, they were the number one.
Yeah.
What a special man to be able to, all three of you guys get up and are like, yeah,
Right.
everybody be able to say that. That's a very loving and giving person, that everyone could say that.
There wasn't a conversation. He didn't end with, I love you to pieces. So when all of a sudden he says, I love you very much, it was like we go back into the natural rhythm of your conversation, but we hadn't had a conversation like that in the longest time. Thanks to talk about the middle child. My brother went off to college. My sister went off to college. I went to local college. I lived at home. I was happy at home. I was very accident prone when I was younger, maybe for the attention. I wanted to get myself as the middle child. So he has this awakening, right? And it's like having my father back. So we're starting to share with him what the grandchildren are doing. So it's been really 10 years since she had 7 grandchildren, 6 boys. My daughter was the only daughter in the family. And we're starting to share what they're doing now because now they're growing up. And he's saying, oh, that's great. And that's wonderful. I know this one always could do something like that. And then he says, isn't one of the grandsons in medical school now? And didn't another grandson start an Ivy League school? And we said, yeah, Dad. And here's the amazing thing, Mike. Those things happened while he was in the midst and the throes of dementia. It's not like something that happened before. It happened while he was in the midst of dementia. So my brother and I saying, how do you know that? Because a lot of times you never really know what a person with Alzheimer's or dementia is thinking or feeling. I was in a support group online and someone wrote, isn't it wonderful that my loved one with Alzheimer's, they're in their own world and they're happy in their own world? And I said to myself, boy, that sounds good. But I never took that philosophy because I told you I would always take them out to movies and to lunch where I could. And I said, no. I told you I had a feeling my father was still in there. So he also knew what hospital he was in and nobody told him. And my brother and I said, the only way he could have known this is that even though he wasn't expressing it, he was more aware in the dementia than people think. And I think that's very important. I think because if you believe your person is still there, and maybe they can't express it the way they could and they can't have the conversations where they could, but if they're aware of what's going on, then you will include them in life. You will show them more dignity. You won't treat them as just someone sitting in the corner. And that was a very important thing we learned and a very important thing that I wanted to share. It's almost like, and when I was telling someone this story, they said, it's almost like when a person's in a coma and they tell you to talk to your person, that they can hear you. And then you hear stories about people being in comas and then they after they come out, they recall something someone said to them. I don't think you can estimate the human spirit, the human consciousness, whatever you want to call it, because I think it's pretty powerful. And I think if you could treat your loved one, even whether it's a physical condition or other mental conditions, and treat them with the dignity they deserve, I think we'd be so much better off. But that was really, really one of the remarkable things for us.
He came home from a long trip and you're trying to catch him up on everything, and he's remembering, he knew where he was the whole time. He's like, yeah, I
That's
got the
right.
emails. I
That's
got the postcards. I know what was going on.
Yeah, it's exactly right. When they're not verbal and the tendency is to say, boy, they're in their own world. But I don't believe they are. I believe they're much more aware of what's going on than we think. And if you take that attitude, I think you're gonna be different interactions with people. So that was amazing. And then we talked about football, right? And I told you this football player's name was Wayne Corbett. I think I mentioned he was an undefeated boxer in the Army. And then he says, my brother asked him, why were you a good boxer? He goes, he was a little light for his weight class. He would surprise his opponents. And he says, I surprised my opponents like Wayne Corbett surprised his opponents. He was smaller, but he was underestimated, and I was underestimated. Then he recalled, it's one of my favorite pictures. At one point, my father bought all the grandkids, including my daughter, Wayne Corbett's number 80 jersey. And we got a picture. And it's a great picture of my father and all his grandchildren, right? And he says, oh, I remember taking the picture with all the grandkids, and tears are in his eyes. And then he says to me, what's Wayne Corbett doing now? And I Googled him and I shared it with him. So that was when I first wrote an article about this awakening before I wrote the book. I actually shared it with Rank for a Bet on social media, and he reposted it to his followers. So it's amazing. He talked about he loved Muhammad Ali as a boxer. He talked about athletes that he liked. Talked a little bit about his business career. So we had these wonderful interactions. With my mother, they were married 62 years at the time. He says, you know, you're the love of my life. Imagine hearing that, you know, from the man you're with so long that you haven't heard that from a long time. So my father had some quirks growing up, right? So he would take, you know, afternoon naps sometimes if he was tired. Sleep was a big thing in my family.
I'll never fault anyone that enjoys a good afternoon
Yeah,
nap.
exactly. He liked the good nap. He would take a long brown or black sock, one of these ones that came up to your knee, and he'd put it over his eyes, okay? And to close. He's lying in the hospital bed, and my mother is sitting there, right? And he says, Arl, her name was Arlene. He goes, do you have my sock? I want to take a nap. I mean, you can't write this stuff. The other thing is my father was always a generous guy, especially in the service field, that if, you know, he was a good tipper, okay? We went from, you know, lower income to middle income. He did better. It didn't matter. He was a big, nice. He would tip people even if they weren't in the service industry. That's how he showed part of his love. So again, my mother's sitting there and he says to, oh, do you have some cash? She says, cash? What do you need some cash? You're in the hospital getting better from pneumonia. He goes, no, I want to tip the nurses and the aides that were so nice to me. I mean, you can't write this stuff. His personality was there. So I really wanted to get my children there to see their grandpa because they were out on their own at the time and they were working. I couldn't get them there till the end of the second day. And he really had reverted back to the full-blown dementia. But we had videotaped him. We had videotaped some of the interaction. And my daughter in particular was pretty emotional. And we have on videotape. And this really led to everything I've done as a second career. So my brother asked my father, what are you happy about? And his exact words, I'm happy just to be here and alive. I'm happy just to be here and alive. And I truly believe that what he was telling his family at the time is, I still appreciate life and I want to live, even in the throes of dementia. So again, besides I'm thinking them knowing more of what's going on, he still wanted to live and he still appreciated life. And I thought that was really remarkable. Maybe it was a message to the family that he's still fighting because he was literally a fighter, but fighting his whole life. But he recovered from the pneumonia. We got long-term hospice care. He was at home. And I like to write. So I said, you know what? I'm going to write an article. And I put it on medium.com where you could write articles. And I didn't know what kind of reaction I was going to get. 10 years later, I have about 330,000 plus views. And I started to get reaction from people. Hey, wow, your relationship with your father is very loving. But you know what? Your story is giving me hope that our loved one in similar circumstances or with other mental issues also appreciate life and want to live. I think that my father's message really maybe wasn't just for the family, but maybe was for others as well. So we were trying to figure out why this happened, right? That is a natural question. Why my father had this 2 day? You hear people having glimpses and, you know, moments of recognition, but 2 days of being himself. So my brother, the doctor, wants a medical explanation. You know, it's got to be a medical explanation first. So in the beginning, he thought that loading up with steroids reduced inflammation from his brain and he had a temporary awakening. I said at the time, I don't know. This is an irreversible downward condition. How can anything reverse it, right? So 10 years later, when I wrote my book and I did a podcast called Awakenings in Real Life, I had my brother on again. He wanted to be prepared. He researched the issue. He says, no, steroids can actually have a negative effect on someone with Alzheimer's dementias. Then his theory was because he got better from the pneumonia, it affected his neurotransmitters and his dopamine levels. I don't know. I don't buy it. Okay. His Neurologist said he's been in practice 30 years, never saw anything like it. My brother spoke to all his colleagues. They never saw anything like it. My next thing was, well, maybe it's a miracle. And I'm not a very religious person, but to me, that was as good an explanation as anything else. Can we pray for another miracle? Yeah, but do miracles happen twice? Then the third thing I wrote in the book is he was literally a fighter. It was a guy from the streets who had a successful business. He was a boxer. He's telling his family, I'm still fighting to live and I want to live. And that's the explanations I had. So I did a little book signing for my book, and a friend of mine came and says, I think your father experienced what he did, so you could write the book and share his legacy with the rest of the world. And I said to myself, you know what? I like that explanation best, because I think the story, for people who read it and hear about it, it does give them hope that people with Alzheimer's, dementia, and I think it goes for other mental illnesses. I think it applies for people that may be going through cancer or the like. Is the humans are capable of a lot of things, and so I shared the story then, and I got some great responses. But I didn't write the book for 10 years. Interestingly enough, I'm an entrepreneur. I did some consulting gigs, and when my last consulting gig ended, I said, you know what? I'd like to share this story in a book and maybe get it out to more people. But I don't think that story's enough for a whole book, right? And I said, boy, I have some great stories with my father, but who's interested? Why would anybody want to hear my family stories? Everybody has their own family stories. So I did some research to figure out, am I going to self-publish? And I found this small husband and wife editor team in California that's wonderful. And when I started to speak to them and I started to share other stories, the editor says to me, you know what you're doing when you're reflecting back on your father's awakening and other family stories, there's something behind that. And I said, yeah, you know what? It's almost like each of these stories has, I call it a mini awakening, or a lesson that I learned. So when I share these stories, like I share stories about my father being a great problem solver, I add reflection pages in the book. And I ask people to reflect on their own life. So when was there a situation where someone made something that seemed impossible possible, and how that had an impact? I tell the stories about acceptance and inclusion, and when has accepting your person's situation helped you in life, or when including them in something had meaning. I tell stories about an uncle of mine who always showed up no matter where we were in the family. If we got home in the air from a trip at 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon, he always picked us up, and sometimes I'm not even sure he knew what flight we was on. He just showed up. My father was in basic training, 18 years old, and this uncle was 10 years older than him in Amarillo, Texas. Basic training. Gets a call, Herb, Cohen, can you go to the barracks? He goes there. He goes to the front rank. Who's there? His brother's coming to visit him when he's in basic training. So I talk about the importance of showing up for someone. I tell a story about small acts of kindness. So this is another example of my father loved to go to the horse racing, right? So I can actually tell you 2 stories about horse racing, and one is about inclusion. So my father loved to go to the horse races, and not the thoroughbreds, the trotters. That's where the driver's sitting in the cart. And used to take me as a kid, and then when I got older, used to take me to the track. I loved the track. So it's interesting. We still even went in the throes of dementia. And you know how I knew he was getting worse? It's how we read the racing form. Over the years, he would circle less and less things on the racing form until he could only knew the odds, and then he could only pick a number. So before I tell you the inclusion story, when my son was 5 or 6, my father, me, and my son went to the racetrack. It was by my house. My daughter was too little. My father has a very good day. He won a lot of races. So we went 10 times on that race. At that day, he won 6 or 7 times. But this day, he was winning a lot. So after we leave, my son, we're all so excited. He says to my son, we're going to go to the toy store. You could buy any toy you want, right? So my son got $100 Lego. Loved Legos. First day of school starts the next Monday. The teacher, as an exercise, says to the kids, "What would you do if you had $100?" He goes, "I'd go to Freehold Raceway." That's right.
He already
Right?
knew what to do with $100.
So I called my father. I told him the story. So I think the teacher might have thought he was talking about the mall, but I knew what he was talking about. Called my father up. We had a great laugh. Later in the week, he says, "Let's go back this weekend." I said, "Dad, we never go 2 weekends in a row, maybe two." He goes, "No, I'm on a hot streak." We go, right? Same, the three of us. He doesn't win a race. My son is so dejected. No Lego this week, right? So I said, "Dad, I'm sorry you didn't win anything." He winks at me. He says to my son, he says, "I want you to know one thing. When you go to the track, expect to lose." Okay? 10 years later, we're at the 75th birthday party. All the grandkids are speaking to my father. My son gets up and says, "Grandpa, I know now you like to go to the casino occasionally. You like to play poker. I want you to remember one thing. When you go, expect to lose." He tells us. He threw back the same advice.
Right.
2015 now. My father's in the depths of dementia, right? It's very difficult to get him in and out of the car. And one day I said, "Dad, is there anything you want to do?" He goes, "The track." I know 3 seconds later he was going to forget he asked. Okay. At this point, my mother really wasn't driving. I'd have to go from New Jersey to New York 2 hours and back to the track and the house. I said, "You know what? He loved the track his whole life. I'm gonna figure out a way to do it." So I did. We're there. It's me, my ex-wife, my son, my daughter, my dad, me, and my son. And the first race comes, and he couldn't even look at the form. We said, "Dad, pick a number, pick a horse." It says number 7, right? Now, my mother, I always remember her reading a book when we were sitting there in the track. She was a voracious reader. She looks up and she says, "Number 7? That's the longest shot in the race. He doesn't know what he's doing." My son jumps in and says, "Grandma, when grandpa feels strongly that a horse is going to win," clearly tongue in cheek, "the horse is going to win." And I said, "Mom, Dad's a great handicapper. If he thinks the 7 is going to win, 7 is going to win." So we put a few more bucks on it. The race goes off. The horse is in dead last. Out of nowhere, down the stretch, he wins by a nose. We're all cheering and whooping. No reaction from my father. My son says, "Grandpa, you picked a long shot in the horse." Explained it to him. And my father was watching. The horse came out of nowhere and won by a nose. The biggest smile came on his face that I hadn't seen in years. That moment of including him on that day just meant the world. In fact, I talk about the story to this day, and it happened 11 years ago. And my son at my father's funeral told that story, the story of his experience with it at the track, and that moment and that big smile on his face. So, it is important to include someone. My father liked to put the car in valet when we went to the track, even though the self-parking was 10 yards from the entrance. The valet parking was like 100 yards. We used to have to walk there. So we went. Even when he had dementia, I would take him. And there was always this one valet that was so kind to us that he would help me take the walker out of the car. He would take me out of the wheelchair out of the car. He'd help put my father in the wheelchair. My father was sitting next to me. He'd motion me to get in the back, and he would drive us to the front entrance. Okay. And I'm not sure he knew we had dementia, but he just knew this man wasn't well. Towards the end, and we couldn't even stay a full day, we would be leaving the gate, and somehow this guy arrived with the car. I don't know if he was psychic, and he would take us back to the front entrance. He could have been parking more cars and getting more tips, but he just wanted to help the family. The small act of kindness had such an impact on the family that I shared that story in the book. And I said, "When has an act of kindness impacted your life?" So that's what the book is about. That's why I say my dad's awakening from dementia woke me up too. So it's not only a story about his awakening and the lessons we learned, but other family stories and other what I call mini awakenings that I want to share. And I give people the ability to reflect and write down their thoughts, and hopefully it can help them in their own life as well.
Dan, I appreciate you sharing this story so much. Such a beautiful and important story.
Thank you.
The stories of the racetrack and being there with your son, like I was sharing that story about the football game.
Right.
I was never, and I'm still not, a Denver Broncos fan, but now sitting, I learn now how important it is to sit and watch those games with pops and just have that moment. And the the reality is, and this is something we experience as we're in our ages now, our life comes back to a full circle. We grow up seeing our dad as the strongest man in the world.
Right.
Your mom would yell, Herbie, go take care of it.
Right.
And they figure everything out for everyone. And then there comes a point where we step in that role for them. And, those of us that are lucky, and let's make sure we don't miss this point. There's a lot of people, unfortunately, that don't have that father in their life. They don't have that father figure. And we're two very fortunate people to have those people there. And it's very fitting we're telling this story the week of Father's Day.
Right. You're right.
And they are our first mentor. They are the person that
That's right.
as we grow up, we want to emulate that subtitle or that title quote of "My father's awakening woke me up too."
Right.
It gave you an insight to we're honoring that memory and passing that memory on. So I'm going to be sure to link to the book in the
Thank you.
description. Um, Such a powerful story for everyone to understand the importance of someone that's been in our life. Like I said, my wife's grandmother had dementia and Alzheimer's, and watching how that deterioration affected my own wife.
Yeah.
Grandma was such an important person in her life, and when you switch roles to now you're taking care of them. But it is important to make sure they're included and that they are a part of the world around them, because there is something going on in there. And on this note, I love to reference the Elvis Castillo song Veronica. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's about his grandmother in the care center and him picturing her before she got sick. Anytime I think of Elaine, my sweet light wife's grandmother, I like to play that song and just remember.
That's
And
lovely.
there's a beautiful line in there that he talks about how she laughs at those who call her name and scream her clothes. And I think of that's what our loved ones are doing. Like they're there and almost like they're joking with us. And it seems like your dad
Right.
had a great sense of humor that
Yeah. He did.
he can almost you almost want him to come out of it right before he passes and say,
Yeah.
"Gotcha,
Yeah.
gotcha."
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
know.
Exactly. You're absolutely right.
So
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Doctor me one. My brother was very active. I credit my brother really for keeping him alive so long. And doctor said to me, and my brother wasn't his doctor, but he overwatched
right,
everything.
right.
And my father was. It's interesting. A number of times in those 10 years, he was hospitalized for something, and my brother often said his organs are failing. He's not going to make it through the night. The next night, my father miraculously, he really had a will to live. Would take my father's blood weekly. A lot of times with elderly people, and not people know, if they don't drink enough, they get dehydrated and they're lethargic. And a lot of times it's just having fluids, and they perk up. So my father, if he was dehydrated, he would get saline fluids. My brother would make sure of it. Really kept him alive. But someone said to me, what are you guys doing? This is not the Herbie we know and love. And they're right. He wasn't the man. But nobody has a right to tell you that your person shouldn't be here. We wanted him here as long as we could have him, because the alternative is the alternative. And I said, even when he held my hand and kissed it, that was enough for me. I have a chapter in the book. I call it a living eulogy for my dad. And We've all been to funerals. Sometimes you go to a funeral, you know someone, but you don't know the person who passed. It's their loved ones. And I listen to these eulogies, and I'm always brought to tears, whether I know the person or not. And then one time I was really struck. I said, wow, they took so beautifully and they just said wonderful things about their person. The person who should be hearing it, right, is the person who passed. And how often in life do we tell people we love you, I love you, or you did a great job? But when have you ever had the opportunity to really talk to your person and really share how you feel? So we had the opportunity at his 75th birthday party. Everybody gave like a little speech to my father. And when I turned 40, I got very emotional. I wrote each of my parents a letter, just a 4 or 5 page letter. And they said that was the greatest gift they got that year. But I tell people, don't wait till your loved one is gone. And it doesn't have to be just an old person. It could be a friend. It could be a sibling. Share how you feel about someone. Write an email if you're comfortable. Sit down and have a conversation. Write an old-fashioned letter. Do a video. But don't wait until that person is gone to really express something. Tell them now while they're living. And I know my father on that day in particular was overwhelmed at the pouring out of, and he was first words, he goes, I don't think I'm that good. He heard all these testimonies. You sure they're talking about me? But here's the other point I want to make. He was not perfect. Nobody's perfect. My
Right.
father had his flaws. He was a human being. To me, he was. He had a way, no matter what I was going through in life, he would say, don't whip yourself. I'd hear those 3 words. I'd feel better. It's like, all right, there's a problem. It can seem like it's an overwhelming problem, but it's not. We'll figure it out. I'll help you figure it out. Don't whip yourself. And in a way of making me feel better. And not that he necessarily could, even if he couldn't solve every problem, just being able to talk to him made me feel better. But he wasn't a perfect human being. Share your feelings with the people you love, and don't be afraid to really express yourself, because you'd be surprised how it impacts a relationship.
Yeah, Dan, that I try to share with people how I love. And I'll tell you, for me, the most cathartic way to do that is sitting down and handwriting it out. There's so much power in taking the time
Yeah,
and getting those emotions out by hand. Dan, I really enjoyed our time together. Such a
me
powerful
too.
story.
Me too.
Thank you for sharing with us who your dad is and
Thank you so
the lessons
much.
he taught you in life. And, just by this brief interaction, and I hope it's not the last one we have,
No, me
I got
either.
to see your father through you. And that's the greatest legacy we can live,
Yeah,
is by being there and being the man, the woman, the person that our father wanted us to be.
right.
Dan, I appreciate your time. Again, the book is called Awakenings by Dan Cohen.
Awakenings in Real Life that's also my website, awakeningsinreallife.com. Social media, the same. You'll have
Yeah.
links, but you can find the book on Amazon.
Yeah.
So
So
I appreciate it. I really do.
thanks a lot for sharing your story, Dan. And we'll catch you guys next time on the Mentor Sessions podcast.